Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno, a book by Father Paul Pearson of the Oratory. Canto 8. Topics: Anger, the door to unexpected sins. Battle against our most besetting sins. Hell is a prison. And breaking through hardness of heart. Our anger, especially if we allow it to ferment and fester, transports us to other sins. It signals us to contemplate revenge, calling either violence or deceit into service to attain its goal. Our anger opens the doors to actions we would never otherwise even consider. Is there anything we would not do when we are beside ourselves with rage? James 1, verse 20 says, "The anger of man does not work the righteousness of God." That's right. It serves a very different master. In line 5, Dante and Virgil observe a signal tower that is transmitting. But what signal is it sending? And to where? To whom? As soon as they see the signaling, they immediately arrive at some rather unpleasant conclusions. The most obvious conclusion, at least from the comfort of our reading chair, and especially if we scan ahead a few lines, is that the lights signal that there is a passenger ready to cross the river they are approaching, the river Styx. It is merely a signal for the ferry to carry Virgil and Dante across to the other side. But there might be a more sinister meaning of the signal, and since this is hell, more sinister interpretations seem quite fitting. The hellish hosts are preparing themselves, marshaling their forces to defend their city against these unidentified intruders. As it turns out, both conclusions turn out to be valid. Pelagius is yet another of the keepers of hell who are silenced at Virgil's command. In line 19, Virgil's words are rather hard to interpret at first. He says, "You'll have us only while we cross the slough." Pelagius had thought he recognized in Dante a soul that belonged in his river. And with his spiritual sight, he reads Dante's soul and says, "Traitor! I've got you now, you wicked soul." He does not ask what they're doing there. Virgil tells him, however, that he will not have Dante permanently, but only for as long as it takes to cross the river. As we shall see, Filippo Argenti saw the same spiritual reality in Dante. And Dante weighs down the boat, and Virgil doesn't, so Dante's bodiliness stands out. In line 33, we see, "Who come before your hour." We've seen already that Dante's reactions to various areas of hell tell us something about the state of his soul. Dante swoons with the lustful because he fights against the same temptation. He is a fellow sufferer. Here we are given another clue to Dante's spiritual state, one that will continue to be used throughout the Purgatorio as well. That the souls recognize him as belonging with them, being one of them. The souls seem to have a spiritual power of discernment, and one of them discerns that Dante belongs here, in the circle of the wrathful. In line 35, the exchange between Dante and the soul in the river, Filippo Argenti, is as ill-tempered as you would expect in the circle of the wrathful. Dante displays no real sympathy, but recognizes the basic ugliness of the sin. Dante says, "But who are you, made ugly by such filth?" Dante's not deceived here. He sees the sin for what it truly is, deformed and ugly. This is the very different reaction from the souls of the lustful, whom Dante mistakenly thinks suffer because of love. He gets caught up with romantic disguise and misses the deformity underneath. In our spiritual life, there are so many battles that need to be fought sooner or later. But we need to direct our energies where they are needed most urgently, without being distracted by the less insistent issues. We need to work like a triage nurse in an emergency room, looking through all the symptoms that the patient presents for the conditions that are currently most threatening. Here, we discern a strong attachment to sin. There, serious work needs to be done right away. Aside from the rather obvious tactic of avoiding the near occasions of sin, fostering a vivid hatred for the sin is one of our most powerful spiritual weapons. We need to build up in ourselves the drive to fight the good fight against our besetting sins, because it will be a fight. Indignant soul! Virgil throws his arms around Dante and kisses him and praises him for his harsh treatment of the soul that arises from the Styx to confront him. Why such an enthusiastic reaction? Something important for Dante's journey must be happening here. Dante previously had been corrected for pitying too much the state of the damned, especially the lustful. The one exception is the souls in limbo, and Virgil has a personal, but not entirely objective, reason for encouraging Dante's pity there. But here Virgil rewards Dante's lack of pity. If Dante is one of them, someone filled with anger, remember the lion with its pride and wrath, then an important and much neglected step in his spiritual conversion is the development of a true hatred of the sin, a recognition of the damage the sin causes. Dante needs to begin to see sin as it really is, rather than being fooled by the many pleasant disguises it wears. He needs to view it as something to be fought at all costs. Dante recognizes the soul himself and the justice of the souls being submerged in the filthy waters of the Styx. Here, what might seem like anger is not a sin, but righteous indignation, just like Christ in the temple. We have to be ready to enter into the spiritual combat, and that requires both the spiritual discernment to see sin as it is, and also the courage to fight against it. In both of these ways, Dante has so often been lacking. Here, he shows real spiritual progress, and Virgil is quick to affirm him in the righteous desire. He says, such a desire is good to satisfy. The perfect happiness of the city of God is mirrored in a horrible way by the dystopia that is hell. Heaven is made blessed by the vision of God and our perfect union with Him. Hell is defined by His permanent absence. Despite the alluring disguise of sin, there is nothing splendid or free or glorious about Satan's kingdom. It is a prison on lockdown. In line 68, we see the city they call Dis. We've traveled from the outer walls of the city, the anti-Jerusalem, the mirror image of the city of God, to the inner walls, the citadel, with guarded gates and watchtowers. The towers are like the minarets of mosques. The culture wars certainly aren't anything new here. The heavenly Jerusalem glows with the gold and jewels of which it was constructed. There, the glory fills the streets, but here, the glow comes from fire, like the glowing furnaces of a forge. The heavenly Jerusalem has 7 gates, and all who truly desire it might enter. The kingdom of sin is much more closed off, with iron walls and moats protecting it from intrusion. But by whom? The iron walls make the city seem almost impossible to penetrate. Natural powers are at a loss here, and there appears to be no way in. The walls are manned by fallen angels, and as angels stand in the presence of God in heaven, here they perform a similar function for Satan. Our reasoning and our entreaties can sometimes move the hearts of those who are disastrously attached to sin, especially if we have a profound connection with them. They are conflicted people. Part of them still recognizes and responds to the truth we are presenting and the connection we're offering. But the embittered, hardened person is often unmoved by our words, even scornful of them. Their hearts have become hearts of stone, and only God can transform them into hearts of flesh again. For some reason, some very sad reason, they have become fortified against the world and their neighbors. The fallen angels don't respond immediately to Virgil's requests. They command him. He seems to recognize that he is in over his head. He asks to speak with them over to the side, alone. And they respond with threats that Virgil will be held there and Dante will have to find his way back by himself. Why don't they obey Virgil like the beasts and demons who are in the circle punishing sins of passion? The hardness of heart that comes with malice is the root of the explanation, as will become clear in the next canto. These demons are no longer open to the appeals of reason. They seem intent upon inspiring despair in Dante's heart, and do quite a good job of it. Virgil tries to reassure him, but can only say that he won't leave Dante alone. He doesn't explain a plan, because he doesn't seem to have one. Virgil's attempt to talk his way into Dis fails miserably. The gates of the city are in fact slammed in his face. He is obviously bewildered himself. We are accustomed to Virgil having all the answers, solving all the problems, but here his eyes were bowed to the earth, and his brow was shorn of all his boldness as he sighed and said, "Who are these here to block my going down?" His powers seem to be useless here, so what can he do? Virgil places his hope not in his own powers, but in his experience of previous victory over the forces of evil, the harrowing of hell when Christ broke open the gates of hell itself. We've already seen some of the effects of the divine power in hell. The gates are off their hinges, and landslides disfigure the landscape. Note that hope comes from experience. Otherwise, it is empty wishful thinking. Hope needs to have a foundation, and that foundation is an awareness of how things have worked in the past. That is why it is easier for the young to experience despair. They haven't lived enough and seen enough to have a solid foundation for hope. When hope falters, we need to draw our minds back to those previous victories and consolations that we've experienced. Hope is fostered by reflection and thanksgiving. As we'll see, Virgil's hope is not in vain. Canto 9. Topics: Trust in God as a last resort, our need for support in the spiritual life, our frustrating lack of progress, and a humble heart and a believing intellect. Exercising and developing the virtue of trust is almost always an unpleasant experience. When we feel confident that everything will work out as we hope, when we can see how it will happen, when we think we can count on our own strength, there's really no need for trust at all. We are merely being self-reliant, not reliant on God. Trusting in God is very often our last resort for us, something to which we turn when we have already tried and exhausted every other option. Perhaps this helps explain why God allows us these moments of intense vulnerability and panic. It is only in them and through them that we can grow in trust. As we open in line 1, Dante is afraid, but he isn't alone in his fear. Virgil has gone pale as well, which does nothing to encourage Dante. Virgil catches himself when he realizes the effect of his own worry is having on Dante. We can hear the uncertainty in Virgil's voice. He stammers, unable to complete his thought. He tries to reassure himself, and we see him struggling to trust. We must win, but what if not? We have such great help on our side, but why is the help so long in coming? Hope is always for something we don't have yet, and it is never easy and comfortable. Much of this canto focuses on the need for trust, not just for a journey through hell, but on the spiritual journey that every human being must make. Holding on to hope is the battle. After all, abandoned hope is inscribed above the gates of hell for a reason. We must hold on to hope if we want to stay out of hell. In line 16, Dante seems to be changing the subject, finding something to talk about to cover up their mutual fears, but that is only an appearance. He's really trying to ask Virgil in a roundabout way whether he knows what he's doing. His words only focus more sharply on hope. Has anyone ever done this before? Is it really possible? This is why people who suffer want to hear from others who have gone through similar trials and so form support groups. They want to know that victory is possible, that they aren't alone on this path. That is why people experience such relief reading spiritual books that accurately describe their own struggles and inner battles. They aren't so strange. They aren't alone. Human beings are social by nature. We need community, and this need for support and guidance is felt most keenly when we are struggling. When we realize that we have lost our way and are beginning to panic interiorly, the calm voice of someone we trust is like salve on a painful wound. The painful experience of learning that we cannot trust ourselves pushes us towards trusting in God. Distrust of self and trusting in God grow alongside one another. Only someone who knows the pain of feeling lost, of distrusting his own sense of direction, is truly ready to ask to be shown the way. "Oh, I know the journey well," Virgil says as he made this trip before, shortly after his death. He was summoned to retrieve a soul from the pit of hell. He has been there and back again. On a difficult journey, we want an experience guide, not a theory. And that is precisely how Virgil presents himself to Dante. From sitting at the feet of philosophers or spiritual gurus to obeying personal trainers or athletic coaches, human beings want someone wise whom they can trust, someone who can show them the way. We want a person to follow. Remember Canto 1, line 136 that says, "He set on, and I held my pace behind," or Canto 2, 139, "Go, for we two now share one will alone. You are my guide, my teacher, and my Lord." Our Lord himself knows our human need. He didn't just teach a theory. He said, "Follow me." In line 37, we are presented with the three Furies from Greek tragedy. They are horrible instruments of justice, pursuing those who have sinned grievously and driving them to either repentance or madness. They are a force of nature, unrelenting, not someone with whom you argue or negotiate in a calm and rational manner. Their presence announces the seriousness of the sins punished within this, and are another example of Dante's blending mythology and Christian teaching. "Medusa, come!" The Gorgon Medusa can turn anyone who looks at her to stone. The journey would be over, and life would be over. There would be no chance for Dante to get things right. The spiritual significance might be that we all have the potential, especially when dealing with certain sorts of sins, to get hardened into place, leaving no room for change or conversion. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For should you see the Gorgon if she shows, there would be no returning above. When fighting against sins of passion, there is still a part of us, our reason, with which we can do battle. Reason works at commanding the passions, as Virgil has commanded the beasts of hell, gradually habituating them to obey. So long as reason is operational, the possibility of subduing the passions remains. But what happens when reason itself becomes infected? And what weapons are available for battle then? Sins that involve reason are the hardest to cure. Since reason is part of the problem because it is already contaminated by sin, it cannot be helpful in the cure. Something from the outside seems to be necessary, something supernatural. This explains why Virgil, as the voice of reason, has no power to command here in the realm where reason itself has been eternally corrupted. When fighting against temptations, we often fail because we trust our own power, our own ability to turn away, to say no at the last minute. We walk up to the very edge of that cliff, saying that we will not fall. We enjoy the experience of being tempted, and we think we're strong enough to back away from the pull of the temptation at that final moment. But experience teaches us a very different lesson, and so does Dante's meeting with the Gorgon. Virgil doesn't trust Dante, even with his eyes closed, even with his hands over his eyes. Virgil covers Dante's hands with his own. Remember St. Philip's maxim, I trust in thee, but not in me. Is that the lesson that the clear intellects Virgil speaks about are supposed to take? When reason is part of the problem, we must be very aware of our ability to deceive ourselves, to rationalize. Covering the eyes is a sign of the untrustworthiness of our knowing power with this sort of sin. Progress in the spiritual life often does not happen at the pace we would like. We want results, measurable results, something to show for our efforts. And the harder we work, the greater the result. That seems only reasonable. But often our efforts seem to produce nothing of value. We seem as impatient as ever. Sometimes it seems as if we are growing worse instead of improving. This apparent powerlessness to fight effectively against sin results in frustration and even despair. But the power of God can achieve in a moment what we have been working toward for years. Our efforts are not useless. They are essential, but they are not enough on their own. God wants us to be very clear about that. No one hikes his way into heaven by his own strength. In line 79, we see how the powers of hell scatter at the presence of heavenly power. The wrathful souls in the river submerge like frightened frogs, and the fallen angels simply disappear. The angel walks on the water of the river, wiping away the grimy fog from in front of his face. And this image is taken over by C.S. Lewis in his Great Divorce. There, the bus driver taking the souls from the gray town to heaven does the same thing. In the angel's manner, there is almost a scorn for the messiness of sin. At the mere wave of his wand, the angel ends the rebellion. There is no dramatic battle, no heroic conflict. He waves his little wand, and there is nothing to resist. Dante carefully diminishes the true power of hell. Their power is only an illusion, at least for those who remain in God's grace. And the littleness of the wand shows how insignificant this particular battle is for the host of heaven. The angel makes the futility of their struggle explicit. And why do you kick your heels against the will of him who ends, can never be cut short? Then he heads off, almost bored, with other business on his mind. So much for dualism. Good and evil are obviously not equals in the battle. In line 112, we see tombs. And the tombs here are pushed this way and that, almost haphazard, as in places very near the water. The sense is of the tombs being treated with a sort of lack of respect. This sense of abandonment and disregard is heightened by the flames present in each tomb, heating them to red hot, like forges. Whatever these tombs are, they are not resting places. Our faith arises not from an intellectual grasp of the truths of faith, but from our own personal experience of the love of God. Because of that experience, we trust him in all that he tells us. If this is why we begin to believe, then why do some people stop? Why do they get off track about the faith? Well, the explanation is not merely intellectual. It happens because of a break in our trusting relationship with God. These failures of faith become heretical moments in the church, when we become obstinate in our own erroneous opinions, when we gather into party factions for support in our views, when we pit one side against another. Underneath heresy is not a confused intellect, but a rebellious heart. Christians become followers of Christ by baptism. By being united with him in his death and burial, we come to share also in his resurrection. Heretics set themselves up as other Christs, and their followers have gone after them rather than Christ. These followers, some of whom we will meet in the next canto, are buried with their leaders. But there will be no rising to new life. They have sided with them rather than with Christ and his church. But Christ alone has given us victory over the grave, and he says, I will call you all from your tombs. The heretics have merely given their followers tombs. Each tomb contains a different heresy, a sort of parody of the communion of the saints, crammed together in their punishment.